Okay, so now we're going to talk briefly about some of the famous collectors of fairy tales, and then we're going to go on to discuss different analytical approaches to studying fairy tales. So, of course, most of you are probably familiar with the Brothers Grimm. Their first names are Jacob and Wilhelm. And, of course, they were born in Germany, and they began to collect fairy tales in 1806. Their first publication contained 86 folk tales, and final volumes actually added up to over 200 tales. And as they revised the stories later on, they tended to sort of clean them up. Charles Perrault was a Frenchman born in Paris in 1628. He was known for sort of telling the fairy tales in his own voice, and he was really good for adding his own morals to the stories and often appearing at the end of the stories in verse. So here's a very common moral that you might see at the end of a story. So I won't read this to you, but you might just want to take a moment to pause the narration and read it to yourself. And this is something that would be very common to see in one of his fairy tales. Joseph Jacobs was another famous collector of fairy tales. You can see that he sort of lived a few places throughout his lifetime, and he really focused on tales that were sort of expressly English fairy tales, from England. He also converted other literary forms into fairy tales, and he was known to emphasize some of the more obscure stories, such as Jack and the Beanstalk. So when we think about studying fairy tales, we want to think about different ways of approaching them. And four different analytical approaches that we'll discuss in this class are the feminist approach, the folklorist approach, the historical approach, and finally the psychoanalytic approach. So let's take a look at feminist first. So despite what you may have heard in the media, all feminism means is sort of the desire for equality between the sexes. And what a feminist strives for is the economic, political, social, and psychological equality of men and women. So if you hear anything else in the media, if you hear that ugly term feminazi thrown around, you can just ignore that. People are misinformed and I think sometimes deliberately misunderstand what feminism means. But truly, all that feminism means is equality. So when we study literature from a feminist perspective, we study the way that it either reinforces or undermines the oppression of women, because of course women historically have been and still are an oppressed group. So this school of theory looks at how aspects of our culture are inherently patriarchal, which is to say they are dominated by males. And this school of theory also strives to expose what we call misogyny. And misogyny is the hatred or dislike of women and girls. And unfortunately, we see examples of the patriarchy and of misogyny all around us. And that could be a whole separate class just about those ideas. But it's pretty interesting to think about these fairy tales and the way they represent women and also men. And I think a really good example to think about is The Little Mermaid. And when you consider the fact that Ariel has to give up her voice in order to find happiness, and for her, finding happiness means landing a man. If you look at that from a feminist perspective, it becomes pretty interesting that she's asked to give up her voice. And of course, throughout history, women have been made to give up their voices metaphorically, to not be heard. So when we study the tales from a feminist perspective, again, we're studying the representations of men and women, especially women, and looking at the way that women are either oppressed or liberated in the text. And unfortunately, you'll probably come to see in many of the fairy tales the representations of women can be displeasing to a feminist perspective. Not all of them, but many. Another way to look at fairy tales is through the folklorist lens. And in this instance, we see fairy tales as part of the greater oral tradition. So we study the way that these fairy tales reflect oral traditions. Again, the first big indicator that a tale has descended from orature is that it is repetitious. It has repetition in the dialogue and in the plots and in things like that. Oftentimes, fairy tales may have these little sort of personalized endings that follow. Again, Little Red Riding Hood is a good example of the repetition. And many fairy tales also follow the monomyth pattern. And I have another slide focused purely on the monomyth here. This is a term coined by author Joseph Campbell, and it would be a very good term to know for upcoming exams. And the monomyth is the classic sequence of actions often called the hero's journey. So we have first the separation or the departure. So the hero departs from the normal world and goes into the second stage of initiation. So in the main part of the story, the hero becomes initiated into his or her true heroic stature. So usually the person will go through trials or rites, sometimes battles or things like that. And during the course of all this conflict, the true character of the hero emerges. And then finally, once the hero has sort of satisfied all his or her conflicts, he or she can return in triumph to deserved recognition. And that's basically the hero's journey. So many critics, as it says at the bottom here, sort of deride this format. They think it's really predictable and unoriginal. And if you stop for a moment and think about some of the movies that you've seen, especially, you can see this monomyth pattern in so many stories and movies. So it's a little bit generic, but it is definitely quite common. We can also view fairy tales, of course, from a historical perspective. So just like any piece of art, literature is a product of a certain time period. So it's going to reflect the social and cultural features of that time period. So we have an example here with The Princess and the Frog. Now, the content of the film certainly reflects the time that it's set in, but it's also interesting that this film was released in 2009, a time at which there was a lot of conversation about how there were no African American Disney princesses. And this is the first Black Disney princess. So it reflects kind of some of the concerns that were swirling around in our culture at the time. We also have the psychoanalytic theory. It's so interesting. And of course, this is based on the most famous psychoanalysts, which would be Freud, Jung, and Lacan. You probably recognize at least one of those names. And the psychoanalytic perspective sees literature as expressions of our individual or collective unconscious, wherein lie our greatest fears and desires. So if you take a look at the fairy tales and you ask yourself, what are the concerns or the fears or the desires that are kind of working behind the scenes on a deeper level in a fairy tale, you're starting to think from a psychoanalytic perspective. So one fairy tale or story that we're all familiar with is Robin Hood, right, who stole from the rich to give to the poor. And the very first recorded Robin Hood rhyme occurs in the early 15th century, which would have been the early 1400s. So if you think about kind of the way society was arranged, for want of a better term, during that time, there was a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor. So it definitely makes sense that this fairy tale would reflect that kind of desire, right, to take from the rich and give to the poor. And most or all of the fairy tales can also be looked at from this perspective, asking yourself, how does it sort of reflect these unconscious concerns or fears or desires that a certain culture or community might have? Pretty interesting. So there's a related assignment on Blackboard for the file named Ways of Reading Fairy Tales. So you can go ahead and check that out. You'll be ready to complete it at this point in the PowerPoint. But there are some more slides after this, so we'll just go ahead and keep right on going. So where did the fairy tales come from? Well, there's the monogenesis theory that says that they are all of a single origin, that they descended from an Indo-European language, and that they were carried by migration and trading. And there's also the polygenesis theory, which means that there are many origins and they are so similar because of the similarity of experiences. So if you think about the different versions of Cinderella type stories that we've seen, some from Western cultures and some from Eastern cultures, we might ask ourselves, how in the world did these communities who had no contact with each other, of course there's no email, there's no Facebook, but somehow these very similar stories are emerging from each place. And we have these differing theories about how that could have happened. There's also the psychoanalytic theory that says, well, these tales are all similar because we all share unconscious needs and dreams and fears and wishes. And also the sociological theories that the moral enforcement and nature itself and religious myths and rituals sort of influenced the creation of these fairy tales. So there's a lot of differing viewpoints on whether or not children should read them. And you've read a few sort of viewpoints on that. And Bruno Bettelheim, in his article, The Uses of Enchantment, talks about how fairy tales help children acknowledge their inner fears and their inner desires and urges. And they present an allegory for the child's development. So, of course, Bettelheim would argue that children will inevitably struggle against severe difficulties. But, just as we see in fairy tales, if they are brave and they steadfastly meet these hardships, that they can master all the articles. So we might think, boy, those scary bits are too intense for children. But they're kind of an opportunity for children to experience and rehearse scary situations in an environment that's actually safe and kind of emerge on the other side unscathed, and to learn that, yes, I can go through hard things and I can go through scary things and it can still be okay. Darnton argues that by ending happily, folk tales permit children to confront their unconscious desires and fears, and as I said before, to emerge unscathed. So the fear of being separated from your mom, right? Hansel and Gretel. The fear of not being loved by your family, Cinderella. All these different fears that we see, children are able to rehearse. They're able to somewhat experience and still find out that they're okay on the other side. So when we take out the violence, some would argue it deprives children of one of the basic pleasures of literature, which is the chance to experience something scary or painful without actually suffering from it. So again, they're able to rehearse these situations before having to actually deal with them in real life, which can be something very, very valuable, I think. So you'll just have to ask yourself, what do you think? Should children hear the classic versions of the fairy tales, or should they hear the Disney versions? What's more valuable? What's more appropriate? And each of us might have a different viewpoint on that, and that's fine. So part of your reading assignment was Bruno Bettelheim's The Struggle for Meaning and Gilbert and Gubar's Snow White and Her Wicked Stepmother. Of course, those are both found in your the Classic Fairy Tales book. And there's a related assignment that you're going to complete here on the next slide. So what you're going to do is from each of those articles, you're going to pull one quote. And keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to agree with a quotation to find it interesting and important and to be able to discuss it. So once you've chosen an interesting quote from each article, I want you to visit the discussion board on Blackboard, and you're going to post two 250-word responses, so about a double-spaced page each. And what I would like you to do is discuss your quotation, and you need to properly cite it using MLA style. You need to explain it, and you need to say why you found it interesting. So put it in your own words and let us know, sort of why you chose it. I'd like you to post both responses by 9 a.m. on Friday, February 6th. And then you're going to respond to a classmate's post in about 100 words. So you'll make your initial posting, and then you'll go and find someone else's to respond to. And it can be about either article. You only need one response. You don't need to post two responses, just one response to appear. And then I want you to continue to follow up on your discussions until our next class meeting. So you definitely want to go beyond saying things like, oh, I agree or disagree, because really the goal here is to have a productive conversation, much like we would have had in class had we not gotten snowed out or iced out, depending which day we're talking about. So do try to go beyond these agree and disagree things and really talk about the material. I have an assignment here. This is from page 270 in the fourth full paragraph. And at the top, here was the quotation I pulled. The child must be helped to make some coherent sense out of the turmoil of his feelings. And then I have my explanation of why I chose it, and then just a little PS at the end with my own kind of feminist take on that. So finally, we'll end with a quote by Albert Einstein, who says, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales.